protist. Now this is one type of protist. By looking at this, what's one thing you think you might be able to tell me about this protist? You know, without really knowing what it is or anything. Joe?
It's green.
Okay.
So it's a plant cell.
Not a plant cell,
No.
it's a protist, but you're on the right track.
Plant protist.
So what do you think
Well,
it being green tells us about this protist?
it makes its own food.
Yeah, this is an autotrophic protist. It's green because it has chloroplast and it can make its own food through photosynthesis. And as we talked about, some protists are autotrophic, some are heterotrophic. And in fact, the protist kingdom, let me just give you the background. We said earlier that they're unicellular, eukaryote, and some autotroph, some heterotroph. Well, actually, that's not 100% accurate. There are protists that are multicellular as well. And really, the protist kingdom is one that was just sort of used to sort of, anything that doesn't really fit in one of the other kingdoms, just got kind of put into this protist kingdom. So what that means is a lot of them are very different from each other. Sometimes they have different types of characteristics, like some are unicellular, some are multicellular. They don't all have a common ancestor. It's really not a great kingdom. In fact, some scientists would like to get rid of protists altogether and substitute like 6 or 7 or 8 different kingdoms that would be more accurate to show how they're all related. Because it started off, there was a plant and animal kingdom. Those are the only 2 kingdoms originally.
Really?
Yeah, this is like in the 1800s.
Oh.
And then they decided, well, fungi are not plants. They are heterotrophs. So fungi got their own kingdom. We're up to 3 kingdoms. And then all the other stuff that's not a fungus, it's not an animal, not a plant, got put into the protist category. And so it's just, okay, it doesn't fit any of those categories, it's a protist. Eventually scientists learned, well, some of these small single-celled organisms are different. They don't have a nucleus. What were those things? Yeah, bacteria. So they got taken out. Bacteria got taken out of protists, put in their own kingdom. But we're still left with protists, which are all sorts of different types of living things. So it's not a great kingdom. In fact, on your objectives for taxonomy, on page 110, if you have your binder handy, if you look at that, and some of you noticed when I gave you these objectives, there are the 3 domains, those are the circles, eukarya, bacteria, and archaea. But then branched off from eukarya, you see animals up at the top, fungi are in there, plants are in there, but then you have all these other things. All of those other things in the system we're talking about are lumped into protists. The way it's set up on your objective sheet is probably a much more accurate way of classifying these things, so that everything that's in the green algae group, they're pretty similar to each other. But right now, they're all in one kingdom, all sort of smushed together. So that's just what that means. It's a lot more complex than just saying 5 or 6 kingdoms, but that's probably more accurate. But still, protist is used, even though it's not a great kingdom. So when we talk about this, we're going to say generally protists are unicellular, but like I said, I don't want to tell you the wrong thing. There's actually multicellular protists, but for our purposes, we're just going to focus on unicellular. Maggie?
What are slime molds?
Slime molds are just a type of protist. There are some sorts of slime mold-like organisms that are fungi, but some are protists as well. They're kind of
Fungi.
yeah. You might find them sometimes in the forest, some sort of slimy patch of stuff growing.
I have a
Like
question.
Yeah, Shay.
Wait, so why are these things important?
Why things are in protists because they don't really fit anywhere else.
Why? They don't have any other characteristics.
Well, they're not so it's because they're not animals, okay? Because they don't have all the characteristic of animals.
We'll go back to
Okay, they're not bacteria because they're eukaryotes, so they have a nucleus. They're also not plants because they're multicellular plants, and they're also not fungi either.
Wait, why not fungi?
Because they have different types of cell walls, they don't have cell walls. They're not all decomposers, so they just don't really fit anywhere else. So we put them in protists. This video sort of summarizes some of that stuff.
Why not just call that miscellaneous?
I don't know.
Miscellaneous.
Hi, I'm Earl Robinson, and in this What Is video, we
right,
discuss a group of organisms called protists. Protists are organisms that have a nucleus and other membrane-bound organelles. Most are one-celled, and they are classified as plant, animal, or fungus-like, meaning they have things in common with these organisms, but they're not quite the same thing. This is because they're relatively simple and don't have tissues and organs. If you think this definition sounds a little confusing, that's with good reason. Biologists use the protist group as sort of a garbage can. If a form of life doesn't meet the criteria for being a plant, animal, or fungus, and it has a nucleus, it's classified as a protist. Still, there's a few characteristics that most protists share. Because protists have a defined nucleus, they belong to the domain eukarya, and they're called eukaryotes. Protists are probably the first eukaryotes, according to what's called the symbiotic theory. The first protists formed when cells that did not have a nucleus engulfed smaller cells. Over many years, these smaller cells evolved into the larger cell's nucleus and other organelles. Most protists live in water, or very wet environments, and most are able to move. Some swim via whip-like projections called flagella. Some glide using hair-like extensions called cilia, and some pull themselves along using pseudopods, false feet made of cytoplasm. Some protists are free-living, and some are parasites. Some live on food, and some get nutrition by hunting food or by simply absorbing it from their environment. Protists reproduce via sperm and egg, or by binary fission, splitting into two genetically identical cells. Protists may be simple forms of life, but they're certainly one of the most diverse.
All right. So again, you see, some of those characteristics, and again, they're just sort of lumped into those categories because they don't really fit anywhere else. So let's talk about some of the main characteristics of these protists. So first off, for our purposes, we're going to say protists are unicellular, eukaryote, and some of them are autotrophic, and some are heterotrophic. And in fact, some can be both. One individual can be autotroph and heterotroph. Because they have chloroplasts, and if there's sunlight, they'll use that for photosynthesis, but if not, they can ingest other organisms to get energy. And protists live in many different environments. Usually, though, it's in the water. So if you go swimming in a lake, you're surrounded by lots of different protists. Okay, if you take a sample of water out of a stream, there's going to be hundreds of protists living there doing their thing.
What about in our drinking
Probably in your drinking water, probably not, since it's treated before it gets to you.
What about my pool?
Probably not, because the chlorine in your pool most likely kills them. So they live in the water, but some also can live inside of other organisms.
Whoa, that's
And somebody asked earlier about a parasite. So some types of protists are parasites. A parasite is an organism that lives in or on another organism, sort of living off of it and usually harming it. Okay? And so yeah, they are bad for you, they cause illness. We're gonna take a day next week and talk about one specific parasitic protist that causes the death of hundreds of thousands or millions of people across the world. We'll talk about that in a minute. I'll give you the name. You may, you've probably heard of the disease. No. Patrick?
I saw a video of these kids in Africa where I don't know what it is, but they put a string into someone's leg. Because it's
Could be because of parasitic worm. I don't know. All right, so now protists, again, this is another category that's kind of mixed because some protists reproduce through this process called binary fission. And if we look at the words, we can probably figure out what this means.
binary.
So how about binary? Anyone know what binary means? The prefix bi will help.
Oh.
like combined.
No, not quite. Bi, the prefix bi means what? Two. Okay? Binary means two parts. Like if you've ever heard of a binary solar system, it's a solar system that has two stars in it. Alright, so binary means two parts. Fission. Do you know what fusion means?
Oh, yeah.
What does fusion mean?
Combining together.
Combining together. Fission is the opposite. Splitting apart. So what do you think reproduction by binary fission is?
When they just
When two things split.
Yeah, when something splits
cool.
into just two
So,
parts. It's a
I
form
can-
of asexual reproduction.
Both of them? No.
Both what?
Both of these two things are asexual?
Well, binary fission is one thing. So binary fission is asexual reproduction.
Oh,
It's just
one
splitting
thing.
in two.
Oh, it's one thing. Okay, I thought there were two things.
So basically, in binary fission, the cell copies itself. It copies its DNA in its nucleus, and then the rest of the cell splits in half, and you end up with two organisms. It only started with one original parent organism that splits in two. And so if you remember back when we talked about living things, what are the offspring like that are a result of asexual reproduction? Joe?
They're exact copies.
Yeah, they're copies. They're identical to the parent. Maggie?
So, like, they could just keep, like, splitting apart?
Yeah, basically, they split apart, and then eventually as those grow, they can split apart.
What if I could do that?
You can.
Would there, how many maggots? We can only handle one, right?
Yeah. We can only deal with one Maggie at a
Well,
time.
there eventually will be more.
Alright, also,
Not like,
yeah, that's fine. Also, some species of protists can actually reproduce sexually. So, for example, some Paramecium can line up with another Paramecium, swap parts of their nucleus, and reproduce, and that's a form of sexual reproduction where you have two different organisms sharing genetic information. But many reproduce asexually. And here you have a diagram showing an amoeba. The first step is for the nucleus to copy itself, and then the rest of the cell can sort of split into two, and you end up with two organisms when you started with one, and they're identical to the original. Rima? Oh, it depends. It could take a few hours to a day. It depends on the species.
It could be some.
All right, so when we group our protists, we're going to just use four very general groups. There's actually many more than this, but we're just going to focus on four. And the four groups are based on how they move. So there are amoeboids, ciliates, flagellates, and sporozoans. Flagellates.
Oh, flatulence.
Not flatulence. Flagellates. Don't confuse them. All right, so they're based on movement. The amoeboids are protists that move using something called pseudopods. Pseudo means false. The root pod means feet. Do you know what a doctor who specializes in helping people with their feet?
Wait, foot doctor.
A therapist.
I know it.
Look at the root.
Emotional.
It's called a podiatrist. A podiatrist is a foot doctor. It comes from the same root. Pod means feet. So pseudopod means false feet. And the way that amoeboids move is they have a very flexible cell membrane, and their cytoplasm sort of oozes forward, sort of streams forward, and then it pulls the rest of the amoeba along. And then it oozes forward, pulls the rest of it along.
So it's like arms. It's like
Sort of. These are, the one we're going to look at is called an amoeba. And I'll show you, this is what an amoeba looks like. No, I'm going to show you a video in a few minutes. It's going to show you an actual moving amoeba. But you can see the shape is, it varies because they have this flexible cell membrane. Their cytoplasm is always shifting and moving. So that's one group. Joe, you have a question?
Yes. Is flatulence hair power?
All right, ciliates. Ciliates move using cilia. I know you guys have mentioned cilia in health class.
Yeah, I
Does
don't know
anyone
what that
remember
is.
what
I have
cilia?
health next
are,
Wait, one minute, okay.
have to do with your respiratory system.
Oh, wait. Isn't it like something that clogs your respiratory
Not
system?
clogs.
What's it called?
Their cilia are small, tiny little hairs. Okay, that in our respiratory system filter out stuff in the air that we breathe. But in the cilia, they allow the organism to move. They're these tiny, you can see, you sort of see on the edge. This is a cell membrane. It has thousands of tiny hairs that all sort of paddle the protist through the water. Okay?
That's cool.
The one that we look at is called a paramecium. That's a cilia, and this is what it looks like. And we're going to get into details about these examples eventually, but we're just talking about the groups. We also have flagellates. Flagellates move using what's called a flagellum. And a flagellum is a tail, a whip-like tail that sort of pulls the protist through the water. They get pulled through the water. One example is euglena. We'll look at euglena next week. It's one of the flagellates. It moves using this tail. And then the third one is sporozoans. Sporozoans actually, they don't move on their own.
Based on how they move. It says not.
Yeah, so they can't move.
So sporozoans, the one we're going to focus on is called Plasmodium. And that's the one I mentioned earlier, one that causes the illness and death of millions of people around the world. And it causes significant disease, not so much a problem in the United States, but in parts of Asia, in parts of Africa. It's a disease transmitted by mosquitoes.
Oh, yeah.
Anybody know the name of it?
Malaria.
Yes,
Yeah,
malaria.
Blood.
And malaria, we're going to talk a lot about malaria next week, but it's a blood parasite
Yeah.
that affects a person's blood cells
They have to sleep in little nets.
because it gets injected into a person's body by the bite of a mosquito, and then it takes over their cells and damages and destroys
Yeah,
the
because
cells.
at my camp, like, when that was like first on the news, like, at my camp, like, my grandparents always made us wear bug spray because, like, there's like a 1 in 10 chance that you'll get malaria.
Well, not around here. There's no malaria, but there are other mosquito-borne illnesses around here. Things like West Nile virus is one that may occur. It's that's a virus, not a protist, but it's again spread by the bite of mosquito.
I was watching this thing on Animal Planet, and there was this a virus, but it was like monster inside you.
Oh my
Scary
god.
stuff.
It was river monsters,
Okay.
but it was like a fish like that, and it, let's just say that it swam somewhere it shouldn't.
Okay. All right. So let's talk about some more details about each of these types. So the amoeboids. Amoeboids are the ones that move using pseudopods. So here you see an amoeba has an irregular shape, but it sends forward these streams of cytoplasm that kind of ooze forward, and that allows it to move, but it also allows it to engulf its food. When the amoeba is going to eat something, it basically sends out these pseudopods that surround whatever it's going to eat, and then they connect on the other side.
What do they eat?
They eat little pieces of plants, other protists, they eat lots of different things. And so they basically just blob around their food source and engulf it.
That's kind of funny.
What if we were all protists? I would eat you, Maggie.
So let me show you a pic. This is one of the pseudopods of an amoeba. You can see it sort of oozing forward.
Ew, it's moving.
So these pseudopods are used both for movement and to ingest food. And so, the video's coming up in a minute. And once they have engulfed their food and surrounded it, whatever it is they ate now is inside of them. It's in a little sort of bubble, and it becomes a food vacuole. And then they can produce enzymes that will break down whatever it is they ate so that they can absorb nutrients from it. All right, and the last organ I want to talk about is one that we mentioned before.
Vacuole.
Contractile vacuole. We talked about it a while back in cells when we were talking about osmosis. Does anybody remember what we talked about with a contractile vacuole? Okay?
A vacuole like holds the thing, right?
Vacuoles hold things, but this is a special one.
Does it move?
It can let things go.
No, sort of, but one specific thing. The contractile vacuole is important for one thing. You remember, Patrick? That's not just stuff. No. So remember, lots of these protists live in fresh water. And because they live in fresh water, what is constantly happening because of osmosis?
Vacuoles are gonna fill water.
Water is coming into them all the time. They would burst, but what does the contractile vacuole do?
Yeah.
Yes, it takes in the water, fills up, and squeezes it, pumps it out so that it doesn't swell up. That's the function of a contractile vacuole, pump out excess water.
So that's how it moves?
No, that's how it gets rid of that water, because in fresh water, the water is always coming into them because of osmosis. They need a way to get rid of it. Okay, here's a
The contractile vacuoles of ciliates are permanent structures that periodically squeeze excess water out through a tiny pore. In some
fills up and
Paramecium
then pumps it
species,
out.
the contractile vacuoles have conspicuous feeder arms, but in most ciliates, the canal system is less apparent, and the contractile vacuole appears as a simple sphere.
Wait, where does it go?
It just squeezes it out.
Did you see that?
Yeah. Yep. And then it fills up again, and then it squeezes it out.
Ew.
All right, this is a very good, this is an amoeba. This is a paramecium, a cilia. And so what you see, it moves slowly. The amoeba sends these pseudopods out pretty slowly, but you see this one extend.
It's gonna eat
And
it.
just watch as it moves, and as this paramecium sort of pokes around here.
Is it gonna eat it?
Just watch.
Gosh. It's getting larger.
And so it's moving. Yeah, it's not fast.
It looks like a Paramecium. Oh, it's stuck. Ew. It's stuck.
Gonna eat it.
Right?
Reminds me of the honey badger.
No, it's not stuck anymore. Ew. This is so weird. Why is it? It's
I
like
don't
a
know why.
hand
I don't know why. I don't know if it's the paramecium's looking for food or something. That's why it's moving around.
Wait, what's a paramecium?
That's the thing that's moving.
No, don't get stuck. No, don't get stuck. No, I
This
know.
is the paramecium.
I know, but what does it do? Isn't it like a parasite?
Yeah.
What is it
It's a
doing?
prototype.
Now it's stuck. It can't get out.
Yeah, so you see as this pseudopod
I'm
extends,
dummy.
it's surrounding this
You
paramecium.
don't go into the.
Eventually, it's going to sort of connect around the other
It's
side.
a death sentence.
We do? Alright, cool.
Well, not, it stops in a minute once these pseudopods connect.
No.
Wait, the video stops?
How does it actually
Do we ever get to see it?
So now it's like, now you could consider that it has ingested this paramecium. It's inside of the amoeba now. Because these are going to fuse together. And now we would call this whole thing what? It's inside of the amoeba.
The food vacuole.
Yeah, it's a food vacuole.
Yeah, but how does he die?
So eventually the amoeba will produce enzymes into this food vacuole that will destroy the
Oh
paramecium,
my god.
break down the molecules it's made out of, and that's what the amoeba uses as its nutrition.
Guys, the video
How
stopped.
could it move so fast?
I know.
Cilia.
All right, Joe.
Do we ever get to see like the whole video of that?
That's all I have. You can find there's a lot of them online. All right, we need to talk about two more. These last two types of protists before we're done today. So the ciliates. We just saw the paramecium. That's what just got eaten. Ciliates move using these little hair-like structures called cilia, and they basically paddle it through the water, allowing it to swim. The one we'll see next week is Paramecium. And Paramecium are these, they're sometimes called slipper shaped. They're shaped sort of like a foot. Here's an actual picture of one. In a paramecium, you can see the cilia all around the outside. That's how it moves around, using those cilia. And it also has this sort of hard shell of a covering as well. That's called the pellicle. Sort of an outer shell.
Example.
And so it has this sort of hard shell, so it doesn't have pseudopods, so it can't engulf its food like an amoeba can. Instead, what the paramecium does, it has this little indentation. It's called the oral groove. You could compare it to a mouth. And this oral groove has cilia which guides food particles in, down here. And then that leads into sort of a little tunnel into the paramecium. It's called its gullet. It's a tube that leads from the oral groove into the paramecium. You could think of that as like what? The oral groove is the mouth.
It's like a vacuum.
The gullet would be like what? Like its throat, like its esophagus.
Oh yeah. So
And eventually that leads at the end to a little food vacuole, which would be like its what? Stomach. Okay, so that's how it gets food into it. How does it get food out? That's a good question. You could probably guess by the name. The paramecium also has an organ called an anal pore. And so what do you think it's responsible for? Removing waste. Eliminates waste through this opening called an anal pore. So these paramecium, as they swim in sort of the spiraling pattern. They kind of twist as they move through the water. And you can see this one sort of moving around.
where's the it's like clear. Oh, it's like that clear thing?
Yeah, it's the outer shell, sort of. You could see as it was twisting, you could see the groove that was its oral groove. All right, and then our last group, the flagellates. These move using a flagellum, a whip-like tail. And the one we'll look at next week is called euglena. It's a green flagellate.
Are we gonna actually like see them?
Are they gonna move?
Yep, they'll be moving. Yeah. Hopefully they're alive when they get
We're
here.
gonna watch a breakup.
Oh, when they came?
And euglena are interesting because they can either be autotrophic or heterotrophic. They're green, they have chloroplast, but if there's no light available, they can go out and find food to eat. So they're autotrophs and heterotrophs at the same time. And you look at the parts, they have this tail, a whip-like tail, and it pulls them through the water. And they do have chloroplast. What do you think happens in the chloroplast?
They get food.
Yeah, that's where they make food. So photosynthesis happens. They also have an organelle called an eye spot. And that is sensitive to light so that they know which direction to go in to find light, so that they can go through this process of photosynthesis. This is euglena. You can see it swimming. You can see the flagellum is down here towards the bottom. And it's pulling it through the water. Kind of looks like a pickle or something.
It's like an old